Welcome to Around the Farm, the podcast about all things ag. I'm your host, Clint, and today we're going to be speaking with Holly Thrasher, a technical agronomist with Dekalb and Asgrow, about managing your inputs throughout the season. Stay tuned. Holly, welcome to Around the Farm. How about you introduce yourself to the listeners?
Thanks so much for having me, Clint. I'm Holly Thrasher. I'm a technical agronomist for Dekalb Asgrow. I live and cover Western Kansas and help support the Western and Central Kansas sales teams. So
nice. What are all the variety of crops that you focus on out in Kansas?
Goodness, we have a lot of diversified crops here in Kansas. So Kansas is known as the wheat state. So we have a lot of wheat acres, and this year we have a lot of wheat acres out. So certainly one of our main crops. We have corn and soybeans, and then quite a bit of grain sorghum in Kansas. We're, I believe, the number one state for grain sorghum production. And then there are a lot of cows in the state of Kansas. So we have cow-calf pairs, so fair amount of silage and hay acres, as well as a few specialty crops here and there. So we do have some winter canola and sunflowers. And if you get into some specific pockets, you may even run into some millet. So a lot of different crops compared to some place like where you're at.
Yeah, we see a lot of primarily corn and soybeans, but that's why I wanted to ask that, because I think I don't think a lot of folks realize the diversity of agriculture within Kansas. That's a lot of crops that are going in the ground there.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of crops and a lot of crops year round, especially with wheat. So planting in the fall, and then we're winding down on planting in a lot of areas right now, but this wheat crop will be progressing and be ready to harvest here next few weeks. So a lot of guys are going to transition from planting to cutting wheat. So not a lot of breaks for farmers around here.
Yeah, that keeps everybody busy for sure. Do you have very much irrigation in that area then as well?
We do. So the Western Kansas geography that I support, we do have quite a bit of irrigation. So our rainfall is a lot less in Western Kansas, and so we are fortunate enough that we are able to supplement that lack of annual rainfall with irrigation. So a lot of the acres that I support are those irrigated, high yield, high management type of corn acres. Certainly over time, as we've seen some of the aquifers reduced in their size and our ability to irrigate. Some of those irrigated acres are more of what I would call limited irrigation, which just kind of adds an additional layer of product selection, management, that type of thing to how we're able to produce a crop.
Well, I know you talked about folks are starting to wrap up planting at this point. How is just from a general perspective? How's the planting season been going for you?
It's gone pretty well. So where I'm at, we have been tremendously dry, especially in the west. So a lot of D3, even D4 drought conditions. So that dryland acre, unfortunately, there were a lot of acres that didn't get planted. And those are an acre that we know year over year, the decision comes kind of at this time frame when it's like, well, we have enough soil moisture and we're going to go ahead and try to produce a crop. With it being so dry, a lot of those acres didn't end up getting planted, but we were very dry. On the other hand, of course, other areas of the nation were wet this spring. So we had a very different challenge in that we were dry. We didn't have quite the cooler temperatures at planting time. So we were maybe a little delayed from normal, but certainly not anything that I was concerned about. We have a lot of GDUs that we can capture in a pretty short amount of time in this geography. So by and large, the planting season went pretty smooth. Um, we didn't have a lot of challenges necessarily with getting the crop in. I would say that our replant situations have been fairly minimal, and that's been probably based around more of the tremendous amount of wind that we've had this spring. So some corn getting sand blasted to the point where, maybe we made the decision that we're better off because we do have time to replant and really get a crop in and established to go ahead and replant. We also had some hail in some small geographies, so little pop-up storms here and there. But yeah, by and large, I would say that it's been a pretty good planting season for us. I would say that the crop looks pretty good from what I've seen so far, and we did get some beneficial rainfall over a lot of the area here this week, actually. And so, as I look at the forecast, where we're going to warm up in the next few days, that crop is just going to take off. Corn is just going to be. It gets to that stage where you just go out to a field and you feels like you can hear it growing. It's just tremendous how that plant can grow so fast under the right conditions.
Oh, I know. This year on our farm, we went from incredibly cold to then it turned out like 95 degrees, right? And everybody was throwing corn in the ground all at once. And I swear it was popping up within just a few days later. You're able to row that corn. It was like one of the fastest emergence that I can recall anyway in the short future anyway, or short past.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that hopefully that has a little bit to do with coaching around. All right, let's make sure that we get this crop in the best conditions that we possibly can, and so not jumping the gun too much on when that crop went into the ground from a management standpoint, but from the other side of the fence, looking at it as some of these newer genetics where we're really taking a step forward in the agronomic ratings and things like emergence that we're bringing to the table with products has probably helped that out a lot.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk about management, right? You talked about making some decisions, even in the middle of planting, where you may have to switch crops or switch a field. Talk about a little bit on how you go about making some recommendations on the front side of the season. Are you putting together multiple plans for kind of multiple outcomes?
Well, I mean, I think yes, we certainly have that plan A, but then you get plan B and plan C put together as well. And a lot of it has to do with certainly this year we've had a lot of challenges around input costs, weather impacts. And so you can make your plan in the fall and say, all right, here's our intention. But if that's an acre where you get to spring and it's like it's not fit to plant due to it being wet or it's too dry, then we have to pivot a little bit or recalibrate and say, all right, do we need to take a different approach in terms of maybe we were going to plant some dryland corn if moisture was available in the spring. That didn't happen. Now you may look at it and say, all right, we're going to grow grain sorghum, which is something that's far more drought tolerant on those acres, and then that change happens. So yeah, there's certainly a lot of those changes in the plan that happen throughout the season. Maybe it's I in the fall I thought I knew which hybrid I wanted, and maybe I couldn't get it, and then that kind of changes your management and your decision thinking throughout the year. Maybe your population's changed because of those environmental factors, or last minute, hey, let's rather than do this, let's do something different on where we're placing those products.
Do you see very many folks, like, if they get delayed, like, moving, relative maturities at all?
For my area, and we went through this last year, especially where we had such a cool, cold, prolonged spring, and we weren't at the appropriate soil temperatures. That guys did, in some instances, change their relative maturities. Ultimately, for us, and I tried to put together a lot of information to share with my customers, around, okay, if we have a relative maturity hybrid that's XYZ days, we know that our GDUs to black layer are this. Based off of the average GDU accumulation in your area, what is the latest that we can plant that relative maturity and still get to black layer within a reasonable amount of time? And again, for us, we are far enough south. We're just in an environment that we get a lot of heat, and so we didn't have to make a lot of adjustments. Now, if you get into this few weeks that are coming up, this June timeframe, mid-June especially for me is when it's like, all right, let's maybe reconsider what those relative maturities that we are planting are going to be. But by and large, I would rather stick with the original plan on the maturity and the products that we're planting. One, because we made a decision to plant that product for a reason, because that was the best option for that acre. And so I feel like if we do have to shorten up maturities, we may not be going to the best product for that field. So,
Now, you talked about the rising cost of
mhm.
inputs, right? And I look at nitrogen being one of those that we've seen a pretty decent spike on. What are you seeing in your neck of the woods as far as for changing or adjusting from just a fertilizer perspective?
Yeah, I think that input costs are high. Commodity prices are also high. Now, what I found is that even when you try to highlight the opportunity with the commodity prices being high, everybody is very quick to say, "Oh yeah, but all of my input costs are so high, I won't be able to make anything." But taking all those things into account, we still need to look at this as we want to raise the best crop we can, even with input cost high. We're not going to put nothing out there. And how do we get the highest ROI? So, adjustments that may or may not have been made. I think that the crop that we pulled off last year was tremendous. A lot of growers had outstanding yields last year, and so I was certainly a proponent of, guys, let's make sure we have a soil test in the fall so we know how much money we got in the bank to pull from that's there versus what are we going to have to deposit as an investment for this crop coming up. Now, there may have been some situations where people said, all right, now's the time I'm going to jump to making a variable nitrogen application that maybe you hadn't in the past. Or you're looking at, all right, instead of putting it all out in the fall, maybe you're going to look at, and you're sitting there in the fall, you're thinking, all right, these prices are high. I don't know what the future is going to do. Maybe you start looking at some split applications that you hadn't done in the past. You're just being very intentional with those inputs and how you're managing them. And I think that that's a good thing for people to be put in the situation where, we need to be careful with our inputs and how we're putting them out there, and being intentional with how we're raising this crop and making the greatest ROI. So, in season here, we have the ability with a lot of those irrigated acres to fertigate. And so that creates a great opportunity for us to kind of spoon feed that crop along from its nutritional needs. And that helps as well.
Yeah, I mean that's what I've seen, over the past several years. It's really been it used to be all, fall and spring applied anhydrous, right? That was like everything that we ended up seeing. And now you're starting to see, whether it's a weed and feed on at planting or whether it's a side dress, urea going out and spreading, and seeing a lot more urea getting put out. Have things like Y drops or fertigation, right? When you can go out there and spoon feed. What would be Holly's recommendation? Like, if you have best case scenario, great growing weather, what would be your best way to feed that crop throughout the year?
I like to see that crop go into a situation where we've got good fertility, but I also really like throughout the season being able to provide what it needs when it needs it through things like fertigation and Y drop. So I think that it's a little mix of everything, and that creates more work. I understand that, but we've made a lot of decisions on this crop before we put it in the ground. At that, just because we planted it doesn't mean we get to walk away and we're done, right? There's still so many times we need to be in the field making those critical decisions, and so I like to have a little bit of a balance there, where we are being intentional with how we put our fertility programs together.
It was really interesting. I was talking to one of our retail partners here this week, and they were talking about just some of the different ways that people put, nitrogen on, right?
Mhm.
And starting to get a little bit more creative. And it was around urea, and I found this fascinating. They were doing a mix, like a 70-30 mix of encapsulated urea and regular urea,
Mhm.
and going out there and spreading that to basically get some instant, with the non-caps layer, and then have this slow release. And it's just really interesting as we see time kind of progress, how the creative activity that we can see going on in the whole world of nitrogen there.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually did my master's degree on some of the nitrogen stabilizers, and that was one thing that we found with encapsulated um, fertilizers was that the breakdown over time can be so slow that you do need to have that initial shot of some food, and then you've got that slower release over time.
Yeah, I'd never heard that before, and I just found that to be fascinating. But so we talked about just sticking with the nitrogen. I got one more question
Mhm.
here. Weather, of course, can change throughout the year. I mean, you can go from wet to dry or dry to wet, and any variation in between. Um, does that change if you are doing nitrogen applications into the growing season? Do you start adjusting that plan based on weather patterns at that point? If it's turning off really dry, are you decreasing or increasing, whatever the case may be?
Yeah, and I think yes, we do. But also, I think the thing we need to keep in mind is, all right, what was our fertility plan? If we put everything on in the fall, or we put everything on in the spring, based off of our weather patterns, is that nitrogen still there? Or do we need to look at, hey, maybe we got a lot of rain, and I don't live where I would have a lot of leaching or denitrification. But if we did happen to have that happen, do I need in season to kind of readjust and start thinking about, water stat in this area for a really long time? Now maybe I need to look at adjusting what my fertilizer or my fertility in season was based off of that, and make sure that that area then has enough crop nutrition.
Do you ever see it like, hey, we're going to have a rock star of a year. This corn's growing like crazy, and I'm just going to throw a little bit more food at this thing.
Yeah, I mean, I try to think about going into the season. All right, where I live, we were dry, and all of the extended forecasts were calling for very below average rainfall, above average temperature. That's not necessarily ideal for us, that we're going to have to rely so heavily on irrigation, because ultimately it's just like any other resource. It is limited. We only get to put on so much water through the pivot. And that said, you make your decisions based off of what you have today, but I also think about where were we at in July last year. We had a couple weeks in there where that crop was going to get to that flowering pollination stage, very, very critical timing in its life cycle, and we didn't have rain in the forecast. We had really, really hot temperatures, which is the norm, and I just thought, man, this is not helping our crop anyway. And at that point in time, I could have said, man, we're going to have an okay crop at best. But you just keep pushing forward. And if you'd given up then, you wouldn't have been one of those people that was cutting 300 bushel corn last fall. So, yeah, maybe we had going into this year where it's hot, it's dry. We need to be very intentional with our decisions, but we need to set ourselves up that if it does rain, if we do have those ideal growing conditions, we're getting the best yields that we possibly can.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you also don't want to cut yourself short, right?
Right.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
Another question I have for you, Holly. I think the technical agronomist role is just a fascinating role with all the different stakeholders that you get to work
Uh-huh.
with out in your area. Take us through a day in the life of Holly working with whether it's our dealers out there, whether it's working with farmers, and even working with your team.
Yeah, absolutely. So the interesting thing is, my husband will say, "Well, do you know what this week looks like?" And he's known me long enough. He shouldn't ask those questions because it's like I have no idea what tomorrow looks like. I may not even know what the rest of the day looks like. But certainly at this point of the year, getting out to look at plots as much as I can to evaluate. Okay, here's the new class of products. How are they looking out of the ground? Because this is my first time to see them in the field. Trying to get dealers um, to get out and take a look at those things as well, just because they need to have the confidence level of how products are looking. But it really just depends on the day. You may be putting a plot in. You may be going to look at emergence. You may get a call from a dealer or a farmer. There's a tremendous amount of crop consultants in my geography that I help support as they have questions about Dekalb and Asgrow products in the field. So I may get a call from someone that says, "Hey, this doesn't quite look right in the field. Can you go take a look?" And so that's this time of year. What a lot of it is getting in the pickup and maybe not always knowing which direction you're gonna be going, but knowing that as that phone rings, the reason they're calling is they need an answer and they need an answer quickly.
Yeah. And when you're putting in, when you say plots, and I know you're talking about new seed products, right? Are some of these plots too, like when we were just talking about different nitrogen practices? Do you see different plots going in of saying, hey, how does this product respond to different types of practices as well?
Yeah, so in my area, a lot of the plots that when I reference plots, those are market development plots through our dealers and retailers that they're putting out. Excuse me, we do have in my geography, we have what we call the VRI, or the variable rate irrigation site, and that is the TD group is the one that does the planting with that, and that's a great resource for us to be able to use as a training site, because we've got the whole lineup of products, but then they're also looking at different irrigation rates to help answer that question. All right, if I have limited irrigation capacity, which products are going to be the best pick? So you get a look at full irrigation, shoot the moon, what's the top end look like? Those type of questions get answered, but then also if I don't have a multitude of opportunities to irrigate because of things like the limited resource on irrigation. What should I place? Well, we can answer that from the VRI site. We also have locally one of the plots that I kind of spearhead is in soybeans, and we have a lot of high pH soils in my area. And a lot of times when you think about planting soybeans on high pH acres, you're thinking of you know, places in the north where soybean maturities are shorter. And so we're kind of in a little bit of a niche maturity for that challenge. So locally, I work with some growers and we put out some screening plots, and that helps us to better understand which soybean varieties have native pH tolerance. We've also got an excellent TD organization. Like I said, they help manage and execute that variable rate irrigation site, but across the whole High Plains through the Gothenburg Learning Center and the TDRs in Western Kansas, Northwest Kansas, Colorado. They're looking at a number of different trials that they facilitate on SmartStax Pro versus other below ground trait comparisons. They're looking at high pH in corn. They're looking at different plant populations, and so they're the ones that facilitate a lot of that local research that answers questions we have.
Well, I know, as time has progressed here, another one of those tools when you're talking about analyzing and tracking is just digital ag
Mm-hmm.
tools, such as like Climate FieldView.
Right.
How has that kind of worked into your role? How do you see farmers utilizing this to track? Maybe it is fertility management and things of that nature, to just try better understanding what's happening.
Right, absolutely. So, I think that the digital tools that we have available to us today are tremendous in helping with decision making, to help with really allowing us to prioritize our time in the field, where to go, where to look, things like that. Like I mentioned earlier, there were a lot of decisions put into this crop before we planted it. There's a lot of dollars and inputs that are out there, and we don't get to walk away from it. And I think that being able to use something like in season, health images through Climate Field View is a great way to be able to continue to look at that crop and say, all right, how are we progressing? Are there things in the field that I need to address, such as, if we're seeing differences in those field health images, maybe it's time to look at if there's an area of the field that's showing up different. Maybe it's fertility, maybe it's weed pressure, things like that.
I remember seeing an image. I think it may have been from around your area, and it was a plugged nozzle on the irrigation,
Uh-huh.
and that they ended up picking up on the infield health images, and that was fascinating. You just had like this perfectly red circle that was all around that field.
Yeah, I think about so not long after I had started my in my role, I had a call with a farmer who said, "Hey, my corn doesn't look right." Now this is September, right? And so my corn doesn't look like right. Can you come take a look at it? You go out there and you're walking into a situation where you're doing a lot of investigation. You're asking a lot of questions because you have no idea what's happened up till this point, and ultimately we're almost close to the finish line, right? That crop is almost finished, and it was really really valuable to me and the FSR that I was working with to be able to go back, look at those field health images, and start looking at week by week. Did we start seeing a trend on when things changed, and why it changed, or areas in the field maybe it changed? And can we then go in the field and identify what that may or may not have been? Ultimately, what we found is that that had a lot to do with lack of phosphorus that on that field. And so some of the differences that were showing up in the field health image, and where we were able to walk in the field and say, hey, this doesn't look as bad versus this area. We're struggling and we're trying to figure out why, had a lot to do with soil type differences. And so, it's just a great tool, because so often in my role, we're going into situations where we're investigating and trying to answer questions, and it just is a tool to help us understand and know which questions to even ask. Because a lot of times it's like, well, what did you do differently here versus here? And yeah, it's a great tool to have in your back pocket. I think too about, we've got a lot of consultants in my area, and you think about somebody that every year is boots on the ground walking that field, the amount of um, just familiarity they have. They know the areas of the field to go check. And things like Climate FieldView, being able to utilize those digital tools, kind of allows you to get that bird's eye view, and be able to take some of the information that they'd be thinking about as well, to where you prioritize your time in the field.
That's 100% right. You talk about somebody that knows that field inside and out, and having some of these tools, you don't gain that knowledge immediately, but man, at least you can get a little bit of an oversight, right? And it's a lot easier to look from above than trying to walk across a 160-acre field,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely, absolutely. And the TAs all have drones now, and so for me, that's been another tool in the toolbox. I know that gets said a lot, but it's another tool that just kind of adds to, as you go to a field, how do we best understand what's going on and how to improve it, or maybe we're right where we need to be, and that's obviously a great day too.
Yeah. These high technology tools are just incredibly fun. You talked about a drone. We have one on our farm, and that's always like the first thing. If a storm rolls through and we want to, assess different things, Dad and I are in the truck, flying that thing around. And same thing goes with like stand counts, right? It used to be like you got to go out and count and everything else, and now you just fly this drone, and 15 minutes later, you got
You got a
a
map
data
that
point
says,
for every acre.
yeah, here you go. Yeah,
No. Well, Holly, I appreciate you taking the time to coming on the show here. I would imagine you've probably already missed like a dozen calls from folks that are wanting to talk to you. So thank you for coming on here. It's always a pleasure.
absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, enjoy the rest of the growing season, and we'll talk to you soon.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Hey, a big thank you to Holly for joining us here today. That was a great conversation around managing inputs. Also, thanks to you, the listener, for joining us. And be sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and share this episode with a friend. And you can catch these episodes on YouTube or anywhere else that you listen to podcasts. Also, Around the Farm is brought to you by Climate FieldView. And with that, we'll see you around the farm.